and welcome to Pod Strangely Warmed, a United Methodist podcast based in the Central Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church. I'm Daniel Hawkins, your host, and I am excited to be joined today by David Worthington. David is the Director of Global Relations for the New Room in Bristol in the UK, and we are here today in the home of Dr. Ted Campbell. If you are any way connected to Perkins School of Theology, you remember and give thanks for Dr. Campbell, and we are here in his room because in the wonderful joy of 6 degrees of Methodist separation, y'all happen to be really good buds.
We are very good buds. I hope we'll remain so after I've left at the end of the week.
Fair enough. You are here in Dallas-Fort Worth for, about a week or so?
Yes, so I've been in the US for just under a month. I started in Atlanta, spoke at Emory, then up to New York, spoke at the annual conference there, then into Connecticut, flight to Houston, spoke at Texas Annual Conference, Chapelwood UMC, and then drove myself up to Dallas, where speaking at SMU and other churches, including Lover's Lane.
Well, very good, very good. Now, Stan would want me to ask you that in all of your travels, you said drug yourself up to Dallas, but truly Dallas-Fort Worth hospitality is the best, is it not? I mean, nobody else is going to see this, just us here in this room and or people connected to Dallas-Fort Worth, so it's okay if...
Absolutely.
Okay. Have you had good barbecue yet? That's the main question.
I have had some excellent barbecue and also some Mexican as well.
Okay. So your stomach has been strangely warmed by good food. Dare we say your heart be strangely warmed?
Well, my heart is always strangely warm when I get the opportunity to come and visit my friends here in the United States, yes.
Well, very good, very good. The New Room, where you are the Director of Global Relations, so I assume that means you get to tell the good story of the place of the New Room's life in our history as people in the Methodist family tree, right? And that's part of what you've been doing as you've made all of these stops along the way. For folks who are unaware, we tend to be a podcast for Methodist nerds. I mean, we are Pod Strangely Warmed after all. But give us a little window into where that story comes from, right? Where that name might come from, and then where that connects to your lived experience day by day.
So John Wesley's New Room is the oldest purpose-built Methodist building in the world. John Wesley first came to the city of Bristol in the year 1739. He was invited by his friend George Whitefield, who had been a member of the Holy Club with John and Charles at Oxford University. George was wanting to return to America, to Savannah in Georgia in particular, and was trying to persuade a number of his friends to take on a very radical open-air preaching ministry. Very radical because most of his friends, of course, were ordained Anglican ministers. And the Anglican Church at that time very much frowned and disapproved of such radical preaching style. Okay. So John arrives in Bristol at the end of March 1739, I think really uncertain as to why he has accepted George's invitation and accompanies George out on his preaching engagements around the city on the 31st of March. And if you read John's journal entry for that day, it's very interesting. He talked about the strange way of preaching in the field, of which Mr. Whitefield set me an example. He then goes on to say, having been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I would have thought the saving of souls almost a sin, if not been done in a church. And when I share that quote, to me, that is John Wesley, the High Anglican, writing in his journal that day. But just 2 days later, I think Wesley goes from being the High Anglican maybe to the Methodist that we know and love, where he talks at 2nd of April, 1739, at 4 in the afternoon, I submitted to be more vile, to preach in the open air for the very first time. And in that sense, what Wesley does on that day is start a ministry, which, of course, we have got to know and love. Yeah. But I think what's significant from my point of view, looking after such an historic building in Bristol, is that what Wesley essentially does within a few short weeks is purchase land to build what becomes known as the New Room, and that many of the ideas which he implements to develop the Methodist movement are essentially tried in Bristol.
Okay. Yeah.
So I would advocate that not only do we have the oldest Methodist building, but you have the cradle of Methodism. In other words, the opportunities that Wesley has presented to himself in terms of engaging with people who were disenfranchised, who had no prior connection to the church. Wesley is able to not only respond to their need for sort of spiritual guidance and instruction, he's also able to respond to very practical needs. So the New Room can legitimately call itself the oldest Methodist schoolhouse in the world before Kingswood was built. It was also offered as a space in which medicines were offered free of charge. John, as many of your listeners will know, had a lifelong interest in the use of herbs for medicinal purposes and wrote his most famous non-religious book was called Primitive Physic.
I love in Primitive Physic, the cure for for a congested bowel is to take a puppy and rub it on your tummy. Like you hold the puppy close, and that's supposed to keep things moving. And so some of his stuff was really good, and some of it, quite humorous today. But
yeah, I think the reason why the book was so popular, again, it's a very practical response to the needs of those people, because many of them could not afford access to doctors, or if they couldn't afford the medicines. And of course, at that time, perhaps what was prescribed would not actually do you much good.
Right.
So what Wesley is able to do is, through his extensive travelling, and he travelled over 250,000 miles in his itinerant preaching ministry, he would have met thousands and thousands of people, and therefore would have been able to pick up many of these sort of ideas and put them through his own filter of understanding about medicine, and so come up with the Primitive Physic book, which essentially was a bestseller for decades.
Yeah. You talk about this moment connected to Bristol in the formation of the New Room, where John Wesley, the Anglican, walks in the room, essentially, and the Methodist walks out. Not only is he being formed in that moment, but the movement that bears his stamp is in kind of going through its trial phases. And so it, in many ways, does not surprise me a bit to hear the heart of what I know of United Methodism today reflected in what you're describing as happening in the New Room back in 1739, right, in 1740, and in that early season, right, where the church is not just looking inward inside the walls, but also looking outward, right? He submits himself to be more vile. I love that language. The bishop at our annual conference this last year had T-shirts printed up and everybody on the cabinet. Now, I don't know what the rest of us had to do to get a T-shirt, but they got T-shirts that said it's 4 o'clock somewhere, right? And the invitation was to take that same spirit that was cultivated in the New Room and look outside in our own communities, right? Get outside the walls of church, because frankly, we've been through a season where the church has been insular in its focus, right? We've had our own squabbles, we've had our own brokenness, we've had disaffiliation to wrangle and work our way through, right?
Yes.
And that has focused us inward. And now the time is to submit ourselves to be more vile, to try something different and new that we wouldn't think would have worked, right? You could see, I love the way you, first of all, deeply impressed, quoting John Wesley's journal verbatim, fantastic. But that movement from almost a place of working through if he's offended at the concept or not, right?
Yes.
To being moved by the Spirit to doing it just a few days later.
And I think what's always interesting when we reflect on John Wesley's ministry, of course, we are aware of the beginning, the middle, and the end. Mm-hmm. The reality for the Wesleys, of course, they lived it in real time.
Yeah.
And I think for me that again demonstrates John's real focus on being led by the Spirit and responding to what the Spirit was saying in terms of how he should move forward with his development of the Methodist movement. That this wasn't something that John Wesley said, I know what I'm doing from this point onwards, I'll carry on.
Yeah.
It's that real sense of having to live by faith and prepared to be challenged in order to challenge others.
Yeah. When he challenged others was, we do know a lot of his history, and that frankly he wasn't trying to start a new thing, but reform the movement that had formed him, right? Yeah. So as he worked his way through this, as he was attentive to the Spirit, were there moments along that journey, maybe connected to the new room, maybe not, that, put him at odds with those who were in, who had been a part of the sacred community there with him, and who maybe had an expectation as to the way the things were supposed to go, and he wasn't living in concert with that?
The Methodists were a threat to both the civil and ecclesiastical authorities of the day. Perhaps most famously from John's point of view, within a few short months of arriving in the city of Bristol and beginning this radical preaching ministry, he exchanges letters with the Bishop of Bristol, who essentially has written to him saying, "Why are you here in the Diocese of Bristol? I have not invited you here. You are not welcome. My best advice to you, therefore, is to go." Wesley responds not with, "I'm extremely sorry, sir, I will leave."
Right.
He says, "This is the work which I feel called to do, and I will stay in the city of Bristol." And then he, to some extent, puts the full stop by saying, "I look upon all the world as my parish." So how the bishop responded to such a letter, we can only speculate. But I think Wesley was clear in his mind this was the calling. And in that sense, I don't think he was necessarily seeking to be disrespectful to the bishop, but I think he felt as though he had a higher master that he had to, if you like, respond to. And of course, one of the other issues around the civil authorities of the day, again, a very radical preaching ministry that says God has a care and a compassion for each one of you, and that you can have a personal relationship with God. What you're seeing at this time, of course, is the movement from what is essentially a agrarian society, with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, people moving into the towns and the cities, but in many respects swapping poverty on the land with poverty in the newly industrialized areas. And I think that what happens to John is that he recognizes that there are people who want to upset his movement because it is not in other people's interest, those who have the power, those who have the authority, to allow this radical thinking to start to enter into people's minds. And so the civil authorities also begin to try and curtail Wesley and his ministry.
He is, by saying yes to where the Holy Spirit was leading, he radically disrupted the status quo in his community, right?
Absolutely.
And it was a real threat, as you said, to the civil and religious authorities of our day, right? I can imagine that led to a number of different squabbles. That one letter back and forth with the church leader in Bristol was probably not the only one, although that gave a powerful context. We as good Methodists, we've heard the world is my parish 1,000 times, and in even raising up when we raise the little ones, right? We are people who the world is our parish.
Yeah.
But to hear its origin lifted up, and that its foundation is in following deeply after the Spirit, even when things are hard, even when his ability and license essentially to do ministry is being challenged in that moment. Say, no. God's got something bigger.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's critical, really, that in some respects, the quote, if you don't understand the context, I think can lose its validity. Essentially, what Wesley's saying to the bishop is that I am responding to a higher calling.
Right.
And in that sense, I think he is very firm in his mind that he must continue the work that God has called him to do.
Yeah.
Another run-in that John Wesley had later in his life in 1784, by that stage, of course, Britain and America had had the War of Independence, and you had gone your own separate way. John Wesley went to petition the Bishop of London, who at that time was still responsible for Anglican preachers in the colonies, because the message that John was getting back was that more preachers were required. As more people went over, there was more pastoral need. The Bishop of London refused John Wesley's request, and so Wesley took it upon himself to ordain men to go over, including Thomas Coke, Richard Watcote, and Thomas Vasey. You will not be surprised to hear that the ordination takes place in Bristol, and of course they join many English pastors already over in England, America. Perhaps the best example would be Francis Asbury, who again responded to God's calling on his life at the New Room at the 1771 conference, when Wesley proclaimed to those present, "Our brethren in America call aloud for help. Who is willing to go over and serve?" And Asbury says, "I made an offer of myself, and it was considered by Mr. Wesley and others that I had a call." So beautifully understated. But essentially what Asbury is saying is that this is, as Wesley had done in 1739, Asbury then responds to that calling in 1771, like Thomas Coke responds to that calling in 1784.
Yeah. Well, and as United Methodist, predominantly in the United States, right? Our listening audience is overwhelmingly stuck here in these United States. As people who've been a part of the Methodist movement, we owe the church that has formed and shaped us in many ways to the power of the Holy Spirit working in the lives of those men who decided to say yes to that call, right? To push through the challenge, to have their own version of submitting themselves to be more vile, right? Because I can imagine that there's a differential between London in that day and the American frontier in that day, right?
Yes.
You know, there's an equivalent for moving the church to the field in a way, right?
Absolutely.
And so we have a great debt of gratitude for the church that has shaped us, even with all of its struggle here today. As I hear you talk, hearing some of the squabbles that have kind of, in a way, shaped the beginning of the movement, that have been a part of the movement throughout our history. Right? If you look at the Wesleyan branch of the Christian family tree, we got a number of little splinters and split-offs and branches that go here and there, and the holiness movement comes out of the Wesleyan family tree. As someone who is grounded in the New Room there in Bristol and is watching the United Methodist Church go through this season of struggle, what does our history say to our present to you? And where do you find hope maybe in the fact that this is not our first rodeo? We're in Texas, so you're going to get some of that.
I think it is absolutely right that we have to acknowledge that even from Wesley's early time of leading the, quote, Methodist movement, there were people who disagreed with what he was seeking to do. When he built the first meeting house, the New Room in Bristol, there were others, including the primitive Methodists, who felt that he had already sort of strayed from the path of preaching in the open air. Just to bring the story up to the 20th century, the three strands of British Methodism, Wesleyan, primitive and free, those only came back together in 1932. So It is absolutely right, and I think appropriate to acknowledge that there have been splits and there have been reunifications and splits again. So I think what's critical, and Wesley wrote about this late in his life in 1786, his Thoughts upon Methodism, where he talks about, I fear not for the people called Methodists. And what he's essentially saying is that if they are a dead sect, then let them go. What is critical is our personal relationship with God through Jesus, and that we are seeking to be disciples and to seeking to be salt and light in a dark world.
Yeah.
And I think certainly in the conversations that I've had in the month that I've been in the United States, I think there is a general feeling that I think everybody now wants to focus back onto what I think we should be seeking to do as disciples of Jesus, and in that sense acknowledge that we've had our differences and that we have, again, to quote this famous Wesley and Whitfield quote, we must agree to disagree.
Right.
That we must seek to engage with those sectors of society that have not heard the good news, don't understand what it means to be in a personal relationship with Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit. And my prayer for the Methodist community here in the United States moving forward is that people can find the place that is the appropriate one for them to be in. Yeah. To allow them to minister to those people in their communities and their churches, and in that sense to become sort of Wesleyan again.
Living out, and you didn't name it this way, but I heard the undertones, and so tell me if you don't hear these undertones, but that deep personal piety and personal holiness, as well as a strong sense of social holiness in the midst of our heart, right? We are here to be in a deep, abiding relationship with God, but also to be looking outward and seeing how that relationship impacts the community around us, right? Where are those places where we're being invited to submit ourselves to be more vile, right? Bishop Reuben Sines is our resident bishop here in Central and North Texas, and the way he has framed this question for us over the last 18 months or so has been, how are we being good ancestors for those who are coming after us, right? And as somebody whose life is so deeply rooted in the ancestors that have shaped and formed us, I'd wonder, what you might speak into that specific question.
Well, I think one of the joyful things about sharing all things Methodist is that we do have both John and Charles Wesley and others, and we've referenced some of those in this conversation, that these are people whose lives have been lived in a way in which they've responded to God's calling on their lives. Now, I think it's important that what we don't do is become fixated on everything that these people did by default meant that it was perfect in every way. There are many aspects of John or Charles's or George's life which, we could highlight. But I think the reason why people resonate with the story is because these are men who, whatever their faults and their shortcomings, I think were focused on seeking God's will for their lives on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And yes, they had disagreements, and those are well documented. But I think what's clear to me from the reading that I've done over many years is that they still were seeking to be faithful in what God had called them to do. And I think that we should, in many respects, take what is a wonderful story to do with the Wesleys, and as we've alluded to in this conversation, the sense in which these lives have not only shaped Methodists, but they've shaped so many other denominations, including the Salvation Army. We must not forget, for example, John and Charles were never Methodist ministers in the way that we would understand that term today. So I think, whilst of course the words can be helpful in framing a conversation, I think it's important that we don't allow that to box us in. And therefore it's important that we understand this story, but we must also recognise, and one of my favourite Charles Wesley quotes is actually not from one of his hymns.
Oh, okay.
And in many respects, it's a quote which I think lays down a challenge to me and to you and to all of us. Charles said, "God buries his workers, but carries on his work."
Yeah.
And I think that's very profound, because there is much that we need to learn about the Wesleys. There's much we need to learn about the Methodist movement. But ultimately, the baton has been passed to us. And we are the ones who are now the custodians of this story. Okay. We are the ones who must interpret these stories in the way that we study our Bible and seek inspiration. We seek guidance in so many things that we perhaps don't understand or are seeking to get more knowledge about. But yeah, it is our responsibility to take it forward. And in that sense, I think it's important that we know the story, but recognise that the story does not end at the end of the 18th century.
Amen.
The story is continuing. And the challenge for you and I and those listening is, what are you going to write on that page? Because if all you're going to write is, I just talked about John and Charles Wesley all the time, but I wasn't seeking to be active in any other way, then I think that one would have to ask the question, is that what you were called to do? So I think that we have that daily challenge put in front of us in the way that John and Charles and the early Methodists had that daily challenge put in front of them. They responded.
Right.
It's now our responsibility to respond to the challenge that we face. And that, of course, involves how we move on as a people of God, following disaffiliation. And, there has been a period of great uncertainty, a great period of sadness. But we are now, I think, at a stage where the parties recognise that now is the time to submit to be more vile and to start engaging with the communities in which we live and work.
Define ourselves by who God is inviting us to become in the next season of life, rather than where the struggle has been.
Absolutely. So, learn from the stories, but apply them to your daily life.
Okay.
One of my favorite quotes, which is not a Wesleyan quote,
We'll allow it.
we will allow it, is from a 19th century American abolitionist called Wendell Phillips. And his quote, which I think is very significant and has certainly been very impactful upon me in my work and my ministry at the New Room, which is the heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. And I recognize my role is in a heritage building.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I hope what I do is I sow seed, whether it's through the talks I share in the chapel, whether it's coming here to the United States and giving talks and lectures. But the heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. And I always remark when I reflect on those words that the responsibility of the sower that day was to sow seed. The responsibility did not extend to bring the rain, the sun, the wind. We know, because the parable tells us, that not all of the seed will bring good fruit.
Yeah.
But without the sower going out that day to sow seed, nothing will
None
grow.
of it would. Yeah.
So that, I think, is a very profound statement for us to reflect on. How am I being a sower of seed? And I think that's always a good starting point to then make decisions about where you move next.
Amen. Amen.
I mean, we often as a staff team talk about the fact that there is never a dull day at the New Room, and I'm sure as a minister yourself you will empathise with that. We can go from speaking to significant VIPs, MPs, councillors, whoever, to then, a guy walking in with a drug addiction who needs accommodation. And so, you never know when you open the gate exactly what your day is going to hold. And in that sense, it is challenging, but I think that we would be doing a great disservice to the Wesleys and the early Methodists if we said, well, sorry guys, that's not what we do anymore. We're just here to tell the story about a museum.
Right. For sure.
So I think that's the challenge about how you get that balance right, to ensure that people who want to come and visit a museum get the opportunity. Those who need spiritual support and guidance get that. Those who need pastoral care get that.
Yeah.
And again, as I'm sure you know well, that there can be occasions when you think, well, I thought it was going to be that, and it's now turning into that, and by the end, it's something different again.
Right.
So I think it's important that people recognise that, particularly where we are, we're right in the heart of the city centre of Bristol. Bristol has a population of about 500,000.
Okay.
So, there's a substantial number of people around. And again, I'm sure you'll know this well, that people will, I think, often make assumptions, and in many respects a good assumption, that I can go into that church because it is a safe space, and that people will be willing to listen, they'll be willing to seek ways in which they can support me. That doesn't mean, of course, that we will say to them, whatever you want, we will give you.
Sure.
But what we are saying is that, we're willing to give time and we can seek to assist you. Yeah. But, so for example, John Wesley created a charity called Stranger's Friend, in which money that was paid into the class meeting system, any money left over, was then made available if people who were not part of the class system but were in need could get some support.
Okay. Yeah.
So I get people coming in very regularly asking for that. What we don't do is give them cash.
Right.
So over the years, I've bought bus tickets, train tickets, food, diapers, formula milk.
Yeah.
So again, it's a practical response to the needs of those who are coming through the doors and saying, "I need some help." And it's very challenging, but very rewarding when you're able to offer that support.
For sure, you're taking a historic space and letting it breed and breathe out living faith in the same moment.
Yes, and I mean, I suspect the situation here in the US is not that dissimilar to the UK, but sadly, many churches are not open during the week. They are on a Sunday, but you might struggle to find a church open to try and get some support during the week.
Right.
And of course, the new room is a space which is open 6 days a week, and therefore people will come in. And of course, they have no interest in you saying, "Well, let me share with you about my denomination and my theological point of view and doctrinal stance." It's sort of like, "I need help here, brother.
Yeah.
Can you offer me something?" And if one feels one's able to, then the access to those funds is there. But I think what's important for me is that we are still a space, nearly 300 years on, where people feel as though they can come in and at least have their story heard, and where we can offer some practical help and support.
That is such a meaningful thing, right? So, because how much is what people are wanting in that moment, right? They have a tangible physical need, right?
Yes.
But also not to be overlooked, not to be ignored, not to have somebody walk by and go, but to be seen and heard and have a place to.
Yes, and one is reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan, a sense in which those that you would have thought would be the first responders to a particular need seem to then be able to find what they consider to be a legitimate reason to walk on by. And in that sense, of course, the telling of the parable just informs us that, I suppose there are two elements. One, that sometimes it's those that you expect to offer that care and support that don't.
Right.
And of course, the other side to that coin is that those who you expect would not offer that care and support are the ones who do step up to the plate and find a way to provide it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very profound parable for us to reflect on when we think, have I got an opportunity here to help another brother or sister? It might just be a little something just to get them over a hump in the road. It might be that you are one of a number of people who will enable them to join the dots to get back into. And of course, again, reflecting on the parable of the seed and the sower, it may well be that the support you give to the person that day, they're back next week with the same issue and the same request.
Right.
But it's not for us to judge how they've done over the sort of previous 7 days or something that they came to see you. We have to be willing to listen to their story and understand if there is some support which we can offer. And I think that's a very challenging place to be. But I think it's exactly where John Wesley would locate his ministry in Bristol today, and I think it's exactly what he would be seeking to do with it. I mean, I often joke, well, I say joke, perhaps I'm being serious as well. Come the day of judgment, I've got to justify the way I've lived my life, not only to, the Lord above, but John Wesley as well, and I'm not sure which I'm fearing more, But, that's maybe a little bit flippant. But I think the point is that what Wesley does is provide us a great example, but I think he also provides us with an opportunity to say, he did it then, am I doing it today?
Yeah.
But, what can you say about John Wesley? Yeah, he was a man with a failed marriage,
Right.
But does that define him?
No. Well, and when we look at the scriptures, right, what do we see again and again? Imperfect difference makers, right? I did a sermon series one time called Rap Sheets, looking at the rap sheets of all of the, the main character, that's a common parlance term for, just like the criminal history, right, essentially, of the people God chose to use again and again and again and again, right? And, again, if we had to be perfect, if we were both sowing seed and watering and being master gardeners and all of that, then maybe, right? But if we're just casting seed, we can be imperfect, right? I've never wanted to go on a missionary trip to Georgia just because of Wesley's example and experience. I don't want to get run out of town in that kind of way.
No, I mean, I often make the what I consider to be an amusing anecdote. I have spoken in Savannah on 2 separate occasions, so I was invited back.
Okay.
In contrast to John Wesley, who wasn't. So I've got one up. I'm just now wondering which of the squares they want to put the statue of me in.
Right.
And I don't think that's an unreasonable statement. But yeah, I absolutely. And, you look at, the way that Christ assembled his disciples, the fishermen, the tax collectors, the engagement with the prostitutes, it's just very clear that those who think that I am not worthy, God says that's when I come alongside you. And I think that's exactly what happened. Wesley returns from Savannah, I think, of the view that he has, quote, failed in his ministry. Yeah. There is an exchange of letters that go on between Whitefield and Wesley, where Wesley actually says to Whitefield, I still feel as I have a ministry to return to America. And he then goes on to say, to preach to the savages. to which George says, John, you don't need to go all the way to America to preach to savages. There are plenty of them here in the city of Bristol. So, you're not going to get out of it that easy, John.
Right.
So, yeah, great stories, but it's got to go beyond the telling of a story. It's got to be how we're living that.
What a profound invitation to us all, I think, right? So deeply rooted in who we have been and the seeds that have been sowed in our lives, right? How are we sowing those for others that surround us? David, I'm so incredibly thankful for your wisdom and for your time. Before we go, one of the kind of undersold or underknown things about the New Room is the place where it is meeting modern pop culture, both in the UK and here in the United States. And so why don't you give us a little brief overview of that? And then I've got a game that I want to play with you, if you're cool to play a game.
Fine, yes. Well, of course, we have what we call in the UK a Grade 1 listed building. It recognises both the historic and architectural significance of the building.
Okay.
That's also recognised by many TV and film crews. The BBC, for example, has a base in the city of Bristol. So over the years, we've hosted a number of drama productions, including Poldark and Bridgerton. We've also featured in a number of documentaries. And so you probably don't need to dig too deep into YouTube or streaming services to find the New Room featured.
Very good. Well, Poldark was one of those shows that captured my attention during COVID, right? As I was streaming through Amazon Prime, I think is where it lives these days. And it is a fascinating window into, and it's pop culture, so there's, some liberties taken in different ways, and it's grounded in a very specific narrative, but a window into that season of humanity in the world, right? That we have our origins bubbling up, right? We see the Methody movement beginning within the minds of Northern England in that time, right? We see it in the show make its way in there. We see Ross Poldark, right, coming back from what they lovingly call in that show the American War. We call it different things around here. It's a slightly, it's a slightly different perspective there. But just to see, as I was looking at the website, I saw a few of these things, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. It was a kind of cool moment for my Methodist spirit. So I want to get at some of those cool moments for your Methodist spirit, but through a different lens than normal. We're around a dinner table here. We're in Ted Campbell's dining room, so I think it's an appropriate place to ask this question. Every day at the end of the day, our family gathers around the dining table. And instead of the "how was your day" conversation, we ask, what was the best thing that happened to you today? What was the worst thing that happened to you today? What was the weirdest thing that happened to you today? Best, worst, and weirdest. And so I'd be curious, as somebody specifically to the realm of this place where pop culture intersects the new room and your own lived experience, what's been the best thing? If you want to share the worst thing, great. If not, don't worry about it. And what's been the weirdest thing?
If I reflect on our experiences of hosting the film crew associated with Poldark, for me, the best thing about that was that many of the actors were curious to develop their understanding about the building in which the show was being filmed. I think many people know that the life of a TV or film star is not all glamour, and there are many hours of sitting around and waiting for your next scene. So our museum was used as a green room. And as a result, many of those actors took the opportunity to have a look at the museum. And certainly I and the other staff members were often asked, tell us a little bit more about John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and this early Methodist movement. So in that respect, I think that was a wonderful opportunity to engage with folks who perhaps wouldn't have ordinarily chosen to come into the space. I think the weirdest moment for me, my office was used as a changing room by Aidan Turner.
Okay. That's a handsome man.
So my wife tells me.
Okay, there you go.
And I arrived one morning to find him having his breeches slightly adjusted by one of the costume team. I'm not sure whether he was more embarrassed or me. I'm not quite sure. But we got over it and we got on with our day, and his breeches looked fantastic, and I got to work in my office.
Well, there you go. There you go. David, thank you so much for being willing to share with us, to be willing to join us today on Pod Strangely Warmed, and share with us a little bit about some of our Methodist history and how it might speak to where we are today in a season where our heart may have been strangely warmed, but we're ready to be set on fire and sent forth, right?
Absolutely. And I think that is a phrase which I have used in a number of my talks, the heartwarming experience in London that both John and Charles went through in May of 1738. I believe what happens to John the following year in April of 1739 is that the heart catches fire. And in that sense, what happens to John and Charles that year is, I think, of a profound effect, and one of the main reasons why we're having this conversation today.
Amen. Pod Strangely Warm family, as we go forth today, know that our hope and our prayer for you is that your heart moves just as the Wesleys did, from strangely warm to set on fire for what the Spirit has for you next. It may look different, it may ruffle some feathers, but as long as it honors God, it is good stuff. May we seek after God's Spirit, not only today, but every day. Until next time, I'm Daniel Hawkins, and this has been Pod Strangely Warmed. This has been Pod Strangely Warmed. If you enjoyed our conversation today, know that you can find us anywhere you find podcasts. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, any and all the places, we are there. So if you want to continue the good United Methodist conversation that you've been a part of today, find us, like us, rate us, review us, and share with a friend so that the good news that is happening right here in our own midst can amplify even more.